The black belt invited a black janitor to spar for fun. What happened next stunned the entire martial arts gym. "Hey, you there cleaning, how about a quick demonstration?" shouted Derek Mitchell from the center of the mat, his black belt gleaming beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. "I bet you've never seen a real fight in your life, right?" James Washington paused mid-swipe, resting his mop against the bucket before looking up. At 42, he had been the quiet night janitor for only 3 weeks, usually arriving after hours when the gym was empty. But that Thursday, the advanced class had run late. "I don't want to interrupt you, Sensei," James said calmly, turning back to a stubborn stain. "I'll just finish up so you can continue." Derek threw back his head and laughed theatrically, the sound echoing across the mats. "Everyone, look at this! He's too scared to even step on the mat." 8 students chuckled nervously, some amused, others clearly uneasy. What Derek didn't know was that James had spent the past 20 years hiding from who he really was. 2 decades had passed since he walked away from the ring after an accident that changed everything. 2 decades of bearing a past so painful that not even his teenage daughter knew the truth. "Come on, man," Derek prodded, flashing the cocky smile he used to intimidate beginners. "Just a little demo. I bet you don't even know a basic guard. Show my students the difference between someone who trains and someone who just cleans." James felt an old, familiar sensation stir in his chest, like a dormant muscle awakening after years of silence. His eyes met Derek's, and for a fleeting second something passed between them that made the instructor instinctively step back. "Just a friendly demonstration," Derek insisted, masking a sudden flicker of uncertainty. "Nothing serious. Just to teach the beginners why respect matters in martial arts." James set the bucket down and rose slowly. His movements were fluid, unnervingly graceful for someone who supposedly had never stepped on a tatami mat. Around the gym, students stopped what they were doing, sensing something was about to happen. "All right," James said finally, his voice calm and steady, like the surface of a lake before a storm. "But when we're done, you're going to apologize to them for turning this mat into a circus." Derek laughed again, though this time the sound was tighter. "Apologize? You'll be the one apologizing to the floor after you meet it." None of them knew that James Washington was once James Silent Storm Washington, 5-time world mixed martial arts champion. He had walked away at the height of his career after an accident that claimed the life of his best friend and training partner. Since that day, he had sworn never to fight again. But some promises are meant to be broken when dignity is on the line. Derek tightened his black belt with a dramatic flourish. "Gather around, everyone. You're about to see why there's a hierarchy in martial arts." The students formed a loose semicircle. Some looked excited, others uneasy. A young Asian woman with her hair tied back whispered to the student beside her, who only shook his head in quiet disapproval. "Here we have a perfect example," Derek continued with a smirk, "of someone who doesn't understand that certain places aren't meant for certain people. Elite gyms aren't for, well, you know." James felt that old twinge in his chest. The same one he'd felt 20 years ago when spectators hurled similar insults at fighters who didn't fit their idea of a champion. But at 42, he no longer let anger control him. Instead, he turned it into something far more dangerous. Calm focus. "Sensei Derek," the young woman finally spoke up, her voice timid. "Maybe we should just continue training. It's getting late, and Sarah Chun." Derek cut her off sharply. "Are you questioning my methods? Sit down and watch. You'll learn more in the next 5 minutes than in a month of regular classes." James caught the fear in her eyes. He knew that look. It was the same one that had haunted him the night of the accident. His best friend, Tony Hammer Rodriguez, had died after a sparring session with James. Though ruled an accident, James knew his own loss of control, fueled by crowd taunts and racist jeers, had played a part. He had carried that guilt ever since. "So, janitor," Derek sneered, "show my students a basic guard. Or is that too complicated for someone who only knows how to push a mop?" Laughter rippled across the gym. James remained motionless, eyes closing briefly as memories of Las Vegas flooded back. The taunts, the flashing lights, the tragedy that ended his career. "What's the matter? Afraid?" Derek taunted, circling James like a predator. Or are you just going to stand there like you stand behind a mop all day? That was Derek's first mistake. He gave James a light shove on the shoulder, meant to be playful but laced with arrogance. The push met resistance like concrete. James didn't budge. Derek felt as though he had tried to move a stone pillar. His confident smile faltered. Interesting, James murmured softly, almost to himself. It's been a while since someone tried provoking me like that. Something in his tone chilled the room. It wasn't anger. It wasn't threat. It was the unnerving calm of a man who had walked through darker battles and come out the other side. But Derek, blind to the warning signs, only pressed harder. Did you hear that, guys? He thinks this is interesting. Let's show him the difference between thinking and knowing. What Derek didn't realize was that every insult, every smug gesture was awakening something James had buried long ago. Not rage, not vengeance, but a razor-sharp memory of exactly who he was when he stopped hiding. Sarah watched with growing unease. There was something about the way the janitor's chest rose and fell, the way his muscles tightened almost imperceptibly, that reminded her of a predator poised to strike. The stillness before the storm. "Last chance, buddy," Derek barked, now visibly irritated by James's quiet defiance. "Either step up for a demonstration or I call security and you can kiss your job goodbye." James opened his eyes. When his gaze locked with Derek's, the instructor felt a cold shiver ripple down his spine, as if he had just awakened a dragon he mistook for a harmless shadow. "All right," James said at last, his voice low but edged with a quiet authority that silenced the entire gym. "But when this is over, I want you to explain to your students why you turned a place of learning into a stage for humiliation." Derek let out a laugh, but this time it carried a nervous quiver. "Explain? Man, you'll be the one doing the explaining when you're lying on the floor." Neither man knew that James had spent the last 20 years not only running from his past, but mastering an emotional discipline that transformed his once destructive rage into something far more precise and far more dangerous. Each insult, each smug taunt, only fueled the quiet strength within him, a cold, unshakable determination that his former opponents had feared, but Derek was about to experience firsthand. Derek straightened his posture, savoring the heavy silence that now hung over the gym. His 8 students closed in, forming a tight circle around the mat. Some leaned forward with eager anticipation. Others shifted uneasily, sensing that this demonstration was spiraling into something else. "Everyone," Derek announced with a showman's flair, arms outstretched, "you're about to witness a lesson worth more than 6 months of training. The difference between those who dedicate their lives to martial arts and those who just clean the floor where real fighters walk." James remained perfectly still at the center of the mat, but something subtle had changed. His breathing slowed. His eyes drifted shut. For a fleeting moment, he wasn't in a Denver gym. He was back in the roaring National Gymnasium of Las Vegas. 22 years earlier, hearing the same venom from the crowd before his world title fight against Victor, the Demolition Man, Petrov. "Look at that little black guy," someone had jeered that night. "He won't last 3 rounds against a real fighter." James had answered with a technical knockout in the 2nd round. But the victory had come at a cost. Hours later, the weight of those hateful words had fueled a loss of control during sparring, a loss that ended with the accidental death of his best friend, Tony Rodriguez. "So, janitor," Derek sneered, circling like a predator, "why don't you show my students how not to do a basic guard? Or is that too complicated for someone who only knows how to push a mop?" Before James could reply, a clear voice cut through the tension. "Sensei Derek," said Sarah Chun, her tone steady but firm. All eyes turned toward the 22-year-old purple belt in jiu-jitsu, a graduate student in sports. Psychology who had spent 2 years researching discrimination in athletics for her thesis. What she was witnessing was textbook material, but it was also deeply unsettling. "Can I ask you something?" she said, meeting Derek's stare. "Why do you think it's necessary to humiliate someone who's simply doing his job?" The silence that followed was deafening. Derek slowly turned toward her, eyes narrowing with irritation. "Excuse me, Sarah," he said coldly. "But who's teaching this class?" "You are," she replied evenly. But teaching doesn't mean disguising racial humiliation as a lesson in martial arts. The silence that followed was deafening. Derek slowly turned toward her, eyes narrowing with irritation. "Excuse me, Sarah," he said coldly. "But who's teaching this class?" "You are," she replied evenly. But teaching doesn't mean disguising racial humiliation as a lesson in martial arts. A ripple of unease passed through the students. No one had ever confronted Derek like this before. His face flushed, anger and embarrassment battling for dominance. "Racial?" He scoffed, forcing a brittle laugh. "This has nothing to do with race. This is about respect for the art and knowing your place." James opened his eyes slowly. There was something in Sarah's courage, the way she refused to bow to authority, that reminded him of his younger sister, Kesha. She had carried the same fierce spirit, the same refusal to stay silent in the face of injustice. Kesha had been only 17 when a stray bullet ended her life during a police confrontation in their neighborhood. James was in Japan, chasing another championship when he received the news. Another loved one lost while he pursued glory. Another reason to disappear into a quieter, anonymous life. "Sarah," Derek said in a dangerously low voice, "if you can't respect my methods, maybe you should find another gym. I'm sure there are places more suited to people with your mentality." The threat hung in the air like poison. Sarah felt a chill crawl down her spine, but she didn't flinch. "My tuition is paid, Sensei," she replied firmly. "And everyone here deserves a learning environment built on mutual respect, not humiliation." That's when James did something no one expected. He smiled. It wasn't nervous or conciliatory. It was the slow, deliberate smile of a man who had just rediscovered a reason to stop hiding. For 20 years, he had carried the guilt of 2 lives lost to the violent world he once dominated. And now, watching a young woman defend the very principles he had abandoned, James Washington began to remember who he truly was. "Derek," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "The young lady is right. This isn't about martial arts. It's about you trying to feel important by belittling others." Derek spun back toward him, his face crimson with rage. "How dare you lecture me about martial arts? You don't even know what a dojo is." James stepped forward. Instantly, something fundamental shifted in his stance. His shoulders squared, his center of gravity lowered. His feet positioned themselves with effortless precision, a posture any seasoned fighter would recognize as flawless. "Actually," James said calmly, "I know exactly what a dojo is. And I also know this place stopped being one a long time ago." A shiver ran down Derek's spine before he could stop it. There was something about the way James now occupied the space, controlled, grounded, unshakably present, that awakened every instinct for self-preservation. But Derek's pride was a wall he refused to climb down from. "Enough talk," he growled, settling into his favored fighting stance. "I'll teach you respect the hard way." Sarah watched with a mix of apprehension and fascination. She had analyzed countless hours of sparring footage for her research, but there was something different about the way the janitor moved. Every breath was deliberate, every shift of weight perfectly economical. It was the calm, coiled presence of a true master, someone who carried a storm beneath the surface. James closed his eyes once more, allowing 22 years of instinct and muscle memory to awaken. Every technique mastered, every victory earned, every hard lesson carved into muscle and memory inside the most unforgiving rings in the world. When James finally opened his eyes, he was staring directly at Silent Storm Washington, 5-time world mixed martial arts champion. "Last chance to apologize," James said quietly, his voice steady but firm. To her students, and to turn this place back into a learning space." Derek gave a short, forced laugh. "Apologize? You'll be the one begging for forgiveness when you're on the floor." What Derek couldn't see was that James had already dissected every weakness in his stance. The high guard that left his ribs unprotected, the habit of retreating with his right leg first, the tiny shoulder twitch that gave away every punch. 22 years away from the cage hadn't dulled decades of elite technical analysis. Sarah noticed students instinctively stepping back, like animals sensing an approaching storm. The air itself seemed to crackle, charged with the electricity of something about to erupt. When Derek threw out another mocking remark and the room chuckled, James' expression shifted, not to anger, but to a calm, frightening clarity. It was the look of a man who had finally found a cause worth breaking a 20-year vow of silence. Derek slid into his favorite stance. Feet wide, fists tight, weight forward, the kind of posture perfected against predictable, rule-bound opponents. James didn't move. He simply observed, eyes scanning Derek from head to toe, cataloging every flaw, the exposed ribs, the unstable base, the tense shoulders betraying each intention. "What's the matter?" Derek sneered, bouncing lightly. "Gonna stand there like a lamppost?" Then James shifted, barely, a subtle lowering of his center of gravity. Shoulders relaxed into a perfect horizontal line. To the untrained eye, it was nothing. But to anyone who understood fighting, the transformation was instant and terrifying. Sarah felt a chill down her spine. 2 years of studying sports biomechanics hadn't prepared her for what she was seeing, the seamless change from an ordinary man into a natural predator. "Interesting," Derek muttered, his confidence flickering. Something primal inside him whispered danger. James stepped forward. Derek instinctively stepped back, the black belt retreating from the janitor. The balance of power in the room flipped in an instant. "Problem?" James asked softly, his quiet authority freezing the air. Blood rushed to Derek's face. His reputation was on the line. He forced a smile. "No problem. Just admiring your posture. Learned that on YouTube?" No one laughed. "Actually," James replied, voice calm, "I learned it at a place called the Las Vegas National Gym. Maybe you've heard of it." The name tickled Derek's memory, but he couldn't place it. Sarah, phone hidden in her hand, quickly searched it. Her heart skipped. This wasn't a weekend boot camp. It was the training ground of the greatest MMA champions of the last 3 decades. "Last chance, Derek," James said evenly. "Apologize to Sarah for questioning her right to speak. Apologize to your students for turning this place into a circus. And most of all, apologize to yourself for becoming the kind of person martial arts should teach you not to be." The offer hung in the air like smoke. Derek could have chosen humility. Instead, he attacked. His first punch, a perfect lightning-fast jab, would have landed against 99% of opponents. But James wasn't in the 99%. He wasn't there when the fist arrived. He slid aside like water around a rock, leaving Derek off balance, arms stretched into empty space. "Nice try," James said quietly. "Clean technique, decent speed, but you telegraphed it with your right shoulder." Derek spun, bewildered. How had he moved so fast? He launched a second flurry, jab, straight hook, his signature finishing combo. Again, James wasn't there. He ducked under the jab, leaned back from the straight, and stepped away from the hook by mere millimeters. "Good combination," James observed, breathing steady. "But you're leaving your left side completely exposed." Sweat began to bead on Derek's forehead. "Thousands of landed punches, and now not a single one could touch a janitor. Stop dancing and fight!" he barked, unleashing a furious barrage. James decided the lesson had gone on long enough. Derek's third sequence, a desperate mix of punches and kicks, sliced through nothing but air. And suddenly James was closer. "How?" Derek whispered, realizing he'd lost all sense of distance. "Do you know the difference?" James asked softly. "Now an arm's length away, between someone who learned to fight in a gym and someone who learned in professional rings?" Before Derek could answer, James simply placed his palm on Derek's chest. No force, no wind-up, just a touch. Derek flew. He wasn't shoved or thrown. It was as if an invisible wave had launched him backward. His feet left the floor, his body sailing nearly 2 meters before crashing onto the mat. Gasps filled the silent gym. Derek lay stunned, staring at the ceiling. No pain, only the overwhelming realization that he'd just faced something far beyond his understanding. "That's impossible," he muttered, struggling to rise. James calmly extended a hand. "Not impossible. Just leverage, timing, and energy transfer. Principles from a 22-year professional career." 22 years? Sarah breathed, her voice trembling. "In what?" Still holding her phone, she read aloud the search result now glowing on the screen. James Washington, also known as Silent Storm, five-time world mixed martial arts champion. Retired undefeated after a 22-year career following an accident that claimed the life of his training partner. The words detonated in the room. Derek went pale. He had mocked and challenged a living legend. Five-time world champion? He stammered. James nodded once. Retired at 29. Since then, I've taken whatever work I could find. Cleaning, maintenance, a simple life. No spotlight. Nothing to prove. The arrogance drained from Derek like water from a cracked jar. I didn't know. If I had known... If you had known, James interrupted gently, would you have treated me with respect? Or would you have humiliated someone else you thought couldn't fight back? The question cut deeper than any punch. Derek realized the issue wasn't ignorance of credentials. It was his own belief that status justified cruelty. Sarah stepped forward, voice firm. Sensei Derek, I trained here for 2 years out of respect for your skill, but what I saw today wasn't teaching. It was bullying disguised as instruction. Students murmured their agreement. James, Derek said finally, humility breaking through. I apologize, to you, to Sarah, to everyone. I have no excuse. James accepted the words with quiet grace. Apologies are only the first step. What matters is what you do next. Derek looked around, seeing his students with new eyes. I'll change, he promised. It'll take time, but I will. Sarah then asked the question no one expected. Mr. Washington, would you consider teaching again? We could all learn so much more from someone who understands that true strength comes with responsibility. James smiled, his first genuine smile of the night. Maybe, but not just to teach fighting. To teach that respect isn't earned with belts or titles, but with character. 3 months later, the gym looked nothing like before. Sarah convinced the owner to hire James as an instructor in advanced technique and martial arts philosophy. Derek lost half his students within a week. The discreet video Sarah recorded went viral, showing a black belt humbled by a janitor. Derek now taught at a smaller gym, his arrogance replaced by hard-earned humility. Sensei James, Sarah said after a class on respect and humility, thank you for proving that true strength doesn't need to be displayed to be recognized. James simply nodded, stacking equipment. Never judge anyone by their job or appearance. Everyone carries a story that can surprise you. Sometimes justice arrives quietly, like a storm that transforms everything without making a sound. James proved that real revenge isn't destroying your opponent, but revealing that greatness lives not in titles, but in character.